one of the questions is how many countries is the Methodist Church in? The short answer is 130. And you'll see a slide in a little while that shows the countries that the United Methodist Church is in. But there are 80 denominations within our Wesleyan family. And those 80 churches, those 80 denominations encompass pretty much the entire globe. But how many countries? 130. What is the one thing that makes the UMC stand out, good or bad, among churches and other denominations? Well, we have a unique system of government, but the thing that's, I think, most unique about our church is fundamentally it's built on theology of grace. John Wesley created, well, not he didn't create, but articulated a theology of grace, a way of living that said, in essence, that our journey in faith is both a matter of social holiness and personal holiness, and that God's grace is active in our lives in order that we might fulfill those twin purposes. And you catch this in the words of Jesus, who talked about the importance of loving God and loving the neighbor. Well, if you're going to love the neighbor, that involves social holiness. That's a way of living in contact and in conjunction with the neighbor that's filled with love. And then, of course, when you love God, that has to do with personal salvation and your personal relationship with God. So, but I think that is the most distinctive thing. And you can go to seminary and get a whole semester's worth of classes on that one question. But I hope that's probably good. Other than the United States, where is the UMC most populous? Africa. We have on the continent of Africa, we have several million members of the United States Church. We have members, as you'll see in the little slide you're going to see, we have members in Northern Europe and Russia, Ukraine, North Africa, but the largest number outside the United States would be in Africa. Then following that would probably be in the Philippines. We have a very strong church in the Philippines.
Max, did you have a question?
No.
Okay, sorry. I thought you had your hand raised. That's my fault. Go ahead.
Good question here. Do the teachings of all churches look the same? And the answer to that is no. That's why we have so many denominations in America. We have people who have different emphases in their theological posture, and that makes for different churches. It begins to get very sort of technical sometimes, but also there's some broad brush things. There are differences in churches in the way they're governed, for instance, and in the way they're organized. And sometimes that becomes a very real and significant issue for folks. So the churches don't look the same. And that's why it's really important to, when you go to churches and go visiting and all, very important to hear and listen to understand. The important thing, and this is a Wesleyan lesson, if you can't agree, you can still love one another. And Wesley was saying, said one time very pointedly, if we cannot all agree, then at least let us love one another. And so we try to do that. And that's one of the reasons why the United Methodist Church, the Methodist Church, and the Methodist churches that we talk about are very ecumenical. That means we're willing to be involved with churches that don't agree with us on everything. And that's fine. That's fine. Why was Methodism created? Well, John Wesley was an Anglican, an Episcopal priest in England. And he really set out to reform the Anglican Church to make it more accessible to people who were lower class. The Anglican Church in the 1700s in Great Britain was pretty high church, pretty stuffy about who got to sit in the pew and who didn't. And there was also a lack of real spiritual depth, frankly. And Wesley started out to reform that. And in fact, when he died in the last decade of the 18th century, he was still an Anglican priest. But by that time, he had formed a movement that had really swept the British Isles and had come to America. And as you talk about church history in your confirmation, you'll get much more of that picture of that story. But it was created as a response to spiritual needs in England. And here's the question that, what does being a bishop mean in the Methodist Church? Well, it means that you've been elected by your peers and by at a jurisdictional conference to be a bishop over an Episcopal area, which generally is either one or two annual conferences. And the primary function of a bishop in the annual conference is to lead the conference and to try to provide some articulation of vision for the church and program. And very important, to work with local churches in the appointment of pastors and pastoral staff. There's a procedure that you go through, but every year a Methodist preacher gets reassigned or reappointed somewhere. And for instance, the pastors in this church will be reappointed at the annual conferences coming up in June to either this church again or to another congregation. But there's dialogue that goes on through all of this, and there's conversation with the laity, the lay leadership of the local church when these appointments are made, as well as with the pastor. But bishops have that to be responsible for.
So bishops are the boss, right?
Huh?
No one's above a bishop, right?
Well, my wife. But yes,
She's not employed by the
you know,
bishop.
in terms of yeah, the bishop is the chief executive, the president. Is presidential and residential responsibilities for an annual conference. But like right there in front of it, like everybody else
Oh, yeah.
who is an executive leader, this is the book, The Discipline of the Church, that tells me and the church what to do. And it says in this book that the bishop is charged with the spiritual and temporal leadership of the church. And then it spends 2,719 paragraphs defining what that means.
Concisely.
It's a lot of fun.
So one story I'd like to share, my middle son was in confirmand. He was, the preacher had just been, was going to be a bishop. And I remember we were going out of church after it's just been announced, and he shook his hand and he said, well, he said, I guess you're important enough to be a bishop, but not a king. You just learn to play chess.
We grew up in the Methodist church, and we never understood why after 4 years, your preacher was full and
Well,
assigned.
There was a very old tradition that pastors could not stay longer than, I think, 6 years in a location. But there's no rule like that now. Dr. Blackburn's been here over 20 years.
Yeah.
And that has been a great thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be hell to pay to replace him when he retires. But pardon my language, I shouldn't do that. But it's going to be difficult because there are people in this church who have never known any other pastor, and so that is a challenge. But it will not be a challenge for Dr. Clemmer either.
So for bishops, is there a minimum number of years before you can be a bishop? How is that?
No, there's no prior qualification in terms of years of service. Most bishops tend to be elected when they are somewhat older. I was 38 years because of my age, but I have colleagues who will serve 24 because they were elected at a much younger age. No. But bishop can only serve for 8 years in a particular episcopal area, annual conference, or in special cases, under certain circumstances, an additional 4. But 12 is the absolute. Those are the questions that you've asked. Let me move to the board over here very quickly and talk about conference. I just want to run through this.
All right, bear with me, we're moving.
We are a connectional church.
Oops.
We're connected. We're not each local church is connected to all of the other United Methodist churches in its particular area. We have a small area that we would call a district. And you have a district superintendent who assists the bishop. Anyway, let me start at the top. This is the easiest way to do it. We are connected up at a general conference of the entire United Methodist Church. Ordinarily, it meets once every 4 years. At that conference, there are delegates from every annual conference in Methodism. And that means a worldwide meeting. That worldwide meeting has about between 800 and 1,000 delegates. And that number varies, but anyway, between 800 and 1,000. It is done in French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, and English.
That's a lot of languages. That's a lot of languages.
That's a bunch. Oh, and Filipino. Now, the translations are not always, the translations of everything that goes on are eventually done all in English. In other words, the little booth that translates sends the person who's speaking in French, sends that to me in a headset, in English, or it's announced in English. But it is a worldwide, it's like the United Nations in that sense. Delegates from every annual conference. There are 5 jurisdictional conferences in the United States and 79, 5 jurisdictional conferences, and 20 central conferences. That's what we call conferences outside the United States in Africa. And they're 20, but they don't have as big a geographical area as some of the ones in the United States. These conferences have as their primary duty and responsibility to elect bishops. Now, they do other things, but primarily they elect bishops, who then serve in one of the annual conferences. In the United States, about 54 conferences, and worldwide, outside the United States, 79. These annual conferences elect delegates to go to the jurisdictional and general conference. They're elected 50% laity and 50% clergy do the voting. Absolutely. The local church sends a delegate or delegates to the annual conference where the elections for delegates to the jurisdictional and general conferences occur. So the local church is the beginning spot for all of that. And between the local church and the annual conference, there is a district conference, which is mostly informational. It doesn't make decisions about policy and that sort of thing. Annual conferences, jurisdictional conferences do make policy decisions, but the most important policy decision maker is the general conference.
Can you say something about the timing of this?
Yeah. Generally in the United States, and let me say, generally in the United States, the annual conferences meet in May and June.
Once a year, right?
Every
Every year?
yes, it's an annual conference. The jurisdictional conferences meet once every 4 years, generally speaking, and they tend to meet in July. They all meet at the same time in July. That's when the election of bishops. And then the general conference meets in the spring once every 4 years. Except that
Except this
this
time.
past year, the 2020 general conference was postponed because of COVID. And it had just been postponed again until 2024. Fundamental reason, delegates from Africa and the Philippines primarily were having difficulty getting visas.
Mhm.
The wait at one embassy was 800 days before you could get an interview. And the United States requires, particularly from the African countries, a rather stringent evaluation of whether or not they're going to let you. There are all kinds of reasons for that. Some of them are. Some of them are. The World Methodist Conference, that meets once every 5 years, and it is just a voluntary gathering of the Wesleyan Methodist community from around the world. And at the World Methodist Conference, you would find a delegation from the British Methodist Church, and somebody from the Free Methodist Church, and somebody from the Methodist Church of Singapore, and someone from the Korean Methodist Church. A lot of these are national churches. They're defined by their national boundaries. And, but worldwide, there are 40 million members of the Wesleyan movement, which is.
That's everybody on the board.
Huh?
That's everybody, all.
Yeah, not just United Methodist. United Methodist, we have a membership of about 12 million.
I don't mean to interrupt. How is the Methodist in Ukraine holding up? How are they doing?
Oh,
Have there been any contact or?
oh, yeah,
just staying?
yeah. I was in a meeting with the bishop of the Russian bishop, Bishop Kigai.
Yeah.
And Very difficult situation. Very difficult situation. And he's the Russian bishop, but he is also the bishop in Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus. They're all a part of this. They're not a great, huge number of Methodists in Russia and Ukraine. But we have enough people there and enough churches there that we need to have.
Right, which makes it even more difficult than it would ordinarily be
Oh,
anyway.
yeah. It's been bad ever since the border war began. Been bad.
Ready for the slideshow? We got about 30
Yeah.
minutes. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to go to slides now of kind of our worldwide church. And first slide is from Mozambique. I need to kind of get over here so I can see what slide is being shown.
Yeah, let me just turn it like this.
Yeah, we
Well,
can't see it.
Oh.
They don't need to see me doing this. So this is fine. I don't
Oh,
need to.
that's
be-
right, because it's screen share.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
This is just an ordinary Methodist church in Mozambique. But you have to remember, as I said a while ago, that our church is worldwide. So Portuguese is the language that's used in Mozambique for most of the country. There is a Mozambican language that is not Portuguese, it's an African language. But for the church, primarily the Portuguese is what's used. The next slide would show you where it kind of all began for the Methodist Church in America. Only this is Ireland. This is the Methodist Church that's a memorial of remembrance for a woman named Barbara Heck and a man named Philip Embry. Barbara Heck and Philip Embry were converted by John Wesley under a pear tree very close to this site. And in the late 18th century, they came to America. And they were not finding a Methodist society to be in. And so Philip Embry began to preach. Barbara Heck said, "We're all going to the bad place if you don't do this." And that's literally what she said. And we need for you to begin to preach. And that's where the Methodist movement in America began to take place. The next slide will show you something very different. And that is Methodist Central Hall in Great Britain. It's right across the street from Westminster Abbey. And you see the magnificence of the place. It was the meeting place for the first gathering of the United Nations, interestingly enough. But that's one of the churches there and shows a bit of a distinction. The next church is the Church of the Sower. Temple of Good News of the Sower. You know, the parable of the sower and the seeds. This is a little Bolivian church. Quite a contrast with what you saw with the big Methodist Central Hall. Next is standing outside. This is a World Methodist Conference meeting. I can't translate all that's on the banner, but it's Korea. And there are two of my pastors from Arkansas there, but this edifice behind you is the church. And if you go to the next slide, you're going to see the foyer and these ladies in marvelous Korean dress welcoming all of their guests to, next slide, a sanctuary that seats 5,000 people and that they fill every Sunday.
That's a sanctuary?
Sanctuary. That the slide you see is just about maybe a sixth of the circle and 3 tiers, and they fill it more than once on a Sunday. So it was kind of a big contrast. And then this little church, again, another one in Bolivia that shows you we're just a little bit of everywhere. In Mozambique, next, this church, when it's at a place called Bahule, and you can't get there from here. We went out to see it and passed by people on the highway, and they saw us going by, and they knew it had to be us because there wasn't anybody else driving, Land Rovers, I guess. And they thought we're not going to come. Well, we couldn't stop there and go into the bush. We had to go out and about and around. And finally, and they were still there waiting for us, greeted us, and then we'll show you something else in a minute. The next church, that's the interior of a church in Moscow, in Russia. As we've already indicated, this has been a very difficult and challenging time for our
It
church.
looks austere.
Hmm?
It looks austere.
It is.
Just
It's austere. But we do have strength from there. We have great strength in Congo. And you'll notice the open air kind of thing, just a tin roof over a pavilion area and people going to church next. But the pastor and his wife were extraordinarily pleased to greet us at their church. And you'll notice that while there is a roof lining by, there is no wall. It was a church with 3 walls. They hadn't gotten enough money together to buy the bricks for the 4th wall. And the amount of money they needed was about $25 or $30. But that's how difficult it is. That indicates how difficult it is. And they want not to be always receiving, they want to be giving. It's one of the wonderful things about the African Methodists. And one of the ways they give is they started classes for women, teaching them how to sew, to give them income. They could be seamstresses and the like. Kind of a neat thing, a way of giving back to their members and to the community. One of the other things that's critical in Africa are water wells. And a lot of American churches have helped to drill water wells, but it's not as simple as it sounds. You can drive. Question?
My dad is for water Africa.
Yeah, well, it's hard to do. And the reason it's hard to do is in a country like like Congo, there are less than 500 miles of paved roads in a country that is a third the size, almost half the size of the United States, a third the size, be that. And, they're even in Arkansas, there are more paved roads than that. But it's hard to get equipment in to do well drilling and that sort of thing. So this is very important. And the other thing that goes on in churches is the feeding of orphans and street people. Now, in our country, we don't have very many orphanages anymore. We have institutions and homes that do foster care and that sort of thing. But in terms of orphanages that have just, hundreds of kids that have no parents, we don't have very many of that. But in Africa, and particularly in places like the Congo, civil war has taken out hundreds of families, and disease has been a major impact. So you have all these children left with no parents at all, and the church helps to feed them. Okay. Another feeding, the ladies dressed in the elegant thing, they're the mamas. They are the ones that feed these orphans every day. Go ahead. One of my favorite pictures of church is that a reminder that it's not just set off on a nice little acreage somewhere. It's right down in the midst of stuff. This was taken in La Paz, Bolivia, from the front porch of the church, looking down into the black market. It's interesting. This slide is important because it shows the major transportation in for church pastors. This meeting, which was an annual conference meeting, had all these people, and there wasn't a single automobile outside the building. All of it was on bicycle. And go ahead next. Or if you were fortunate, you might fly into a place, and we have missionary planes that take people and supplies in to remote areas, as well as serve as hospital lifts for people from remote areas into good medical care. Next. But it's not just in the backcountry. One of the places where your church exists is on the front lines. This is that's me with the bald head and purple shirt. And to my left are a retired chaplain and an active duty chaplain. And to my right are two naval officers, the commander and the executive, or the captain and the executive commander of a guided missile destroyer sitting in Pearl Harbor. And if my memory serves, this particular guided missile destroyer has in its armaments more firepower and all than all of the bombs dropped in Europe in World War II. It's kind of scary. But your church is there. That's the point. The church is there trying to help guys that are going to have to make terrible decisions, fighting to work their way through that. Okay, next slide. And the church is in Moscow. Now there you see my happy smiling face, but these are all seminary graduates from our seminary in Moscow. Neat. Okay. Church tries to do medicine wherever they are. This is a clinic that's run by a particular church, a Korean church actually. And when you went in to be treated, they gave you a rose as you left. Always do. Next. One of the neat things is leadership in worship and choirs. And if you want to go to church, if you really want to go to church, go to an African church where the choirs are singing. It's a magnificent spiritual experience. And it's important to note that these are not missionaries that are leading this. Missionaries go and help train people, but they turn it over to the folks that are there. Next slide. Schools, what can you say? We just run schools for people when there are no schools. And that's your church. In Cambodia, a missionary person is visiting with a Cambodian church member in a little house that's on stilts. And in order to get to that house, you have to walk that 2x4 out over the water. It doesn't really show very well, but that's where the church is next. And here's another picture, not the same house, obviously, but one of our mission personnel doing public health surveys with these folks. And then this is how you get around sometimes. This is on the main street of a town in South America, and a town of about 30, 40,000 people. And the Jeep is stuck over the wheels in the mud after one rain. It was kind of fun, but we were hardly getting it. This is the same town, but the hospital that the government couldn't make work, was turned over to the church, and the church made it work. Turn it. But it's not that kind of a hospital that you would expect. This is the operating room. You know, it's not like our hospitals. More water wells and more water being poured. Next slide. You all grow up knowing you're supposed to wash your hands, right?
Yeah.
You know, in some countries, there's no water in the house to wash your hands with. So people don't, like you guys, don't grow up knowing to wash your hands. So the church does in what kindergarten sessions for public health, teaching little children about the importance of hygiene and cleanliness. Next. All right, this is the map that shows the dark color, the very dark picture. That's the Eurasian Annual Conference. That's where Bishop Kigai is. That's Russia. And all of the conferences, all of the colored spaces are spaces where the United Methodist Church exists. So, and if you can't see it, but over down in here, Thailand, Cambodia, the Philippines, very strong church.
So again, the black is what conference is that?
Huh?
The black,
That's Russia.
and that's, is it a conference over here?
No, that's a part of the United Methodist Church.
The one in Russia is.
Yes, but now there are not very many. I wouldn't, it's 11 time zones, but there are not very many people in
there.
those 11 time zones that are United
And
Methodist.
so Scott, when you were in Ukraine, it was also part of the same conference then, right?
Yeah.
So
Same.
Hello, Baptists.
So that's one bishop over that
One-
whole
one
area?
bishop,
That's
yeah.
a lot of miles to cover.
Okay.
And then we extend in Africa too, is that the same color, isn't that black also in Africa?
No, that's just, no, that's actually dark blue.
Oh.
And if you look at the United States, you see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors. And there are 5 jurisdictions in the United States. Okay.
So could you go back to Africa? You know, we have a support group in Kenya. And so Kenya's is it with Uganda or where's?
That's over in here. Yeah. The
We have it in Mojito, which is west and a little bit south of Nairobi.
okay.
There's a church that we support.
Could you show us the slide of the jurisdictions? You see, our jurisdiction here is in orange, and Western North Carolina is noted there. Okay.
And how many conferences are in
Next.
our jurisdiction?
Hmm?
How many conferences are in the Southeastern jurisdiction?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. Probably
There's 2 in
about
North
10 or
Carolina.
11. Huh?
2 in North Carolina.
2 in
right?
North Carolina, North Georgia,
Virginia.
Alabama, West Florida, North and South, I'm sorry, South Georgia, yeah, Florida, South Carolina, Virginia. There must be probably 13, I'd imagine, about.
And each jurisdiction has a council or is it college of bishops, is that?
Yes,
And
yes.
so sometimes we see something that a letter or something that is agreed to by the College of Bishops. Can you explain a little bit about how that happens?
Well, if some crisis occurs or some crisis of some kind occurs, sometimes it's appropriate for the church to speak to it. And the College of Bishops is empowered to do that and to articulate the concerns of the church theologically about whatever the issue may be.
So is that usually done at the jurisdictional level?
No,
or is
yeah,
it-
it's done at the jurisdictional level. but it's the jurisdictional college of bishops that does it. It's not done at the jurisdictional conference, however.
Yeah.
It could be, but
Doesn't work out, that's what
yeah,
Steve did.
quite often it's not.
Okay.
Okay, just here was a picture of an ordination service in Congo. You were there. Go ahead. And here are people that are welcoming us with a kind of a little playlet to welcome us to their church. Next slide. And there's me. We gave them some small gifts for children, and they were so surprised. They didn't expect anything. And these were small things, you know, crayons and colored pencils and stuff like that. And they didn't know what to do. And so they gave us this basket.
You hold it up to the camera so they can see it.
Beautiful.
There you go.
So what country was that? I didn't recognize.
And they gave us this basket. It was their collection basket. It was the basket they collected the offerings in, and they filled it with flower blossoms. And that's what I'm looking at there is, you know.
Yeah.
But this is a special gift because they so wanted not just to receive, but to give. A wonderful kind of spirit. Next slide.
So what country did you say this is?
This is in Mozambique.
Mozambique.
It's another annual conference picture with no cars outside. Go ahead to the next one. All right, very quickly, this is the last thing. This is Miguel. Miguel is a seminary student, or was, he's in Bolivia at our Methodist seminary. And he rode 40 miles on Friday afternoon out to the little church he served. Was there Friday night, all day Saturday night, Sunday night. And then rode his bicycle back to classes on Monday morning. 40 miles. He asked me if I'd like to go visiting with him. And he said, we have, and then he said, ¿Cómo se dice? Which means, how do you say backsliders? And I said, we got some of those. And so I got on the handlebars of his bicycle and off we went down a track.
You
Go to
didn't
the
get a
next
picture of
picture.
that?
Huh?
You didn't get a picture of that?
No, I do not. To go to the next picture. And the last house we visited was this man. You see this little, it's chickens in the barnyard. The man is with his two sons, one very young, well, both of them young. And he lost his wife in childbirth. He could not read or write his own language. But he was a seeker, and Miguel knew of him and went to talk to him. And kneeling there in the barnyard, Miguel took a picture book of Bible stories and went through the picture book, showing the creation and showing Jesus and showing, you know, John the Baptist and all of that, all of these stories, saying to the man, in essence, God loves you, God cares for you, God has not forgotten you, and the church wants to wrap its arms around you. And he said it in Spanish much more elegantly than I just did. By the end of his time with the man's face was just flooded with tears. And he looked up at Miguel and he said, you mean to tell me that God really loves me and my boys enough that he sent his own son that I might find happiness and wholeness in life? the important thing about this. You were there. That's what you helped have in a worldwide church. That's what you helped create that moment. So thank you very much. That's finally this. It's a banyan tree. Banyan tree has many roots that come out of the ground and grow up into a single stalk, into a single trunk or single trunks. But it's a very strong tree. Lasts for a long time. Has lots of sources of strength flowing into it. It reminds me of our worldwide church, like a banyan tree. So thank you. That's all I have to say.
Questions, comments?
What, did anything surprise you? Did you learn anything?
Sally's got something on the screen.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Did I hear you say that you had a seminary in Moscow?
Yes.
How about those seminarians right now? Have they been recalled home, or they sent back to their homes, or is it still active?
Oh, it's still active now. Given the situation with Russia right now, I don't know where the seminarians are. I do not know whether they're even able to have in-person lessons. Thank God there was a time period during the heavy part of COVID pandemic, they were not meeting personally, but they were Zoom or whatever the Russian equivalent is. But yes, it's still open. And I talked to the seminary president about 2 weeks ago, I guess. He was in the United States when everything kind of came apart and went back to Russia. And in order to get there, he had to fly to his family from the United States and then fly to the Congo back into Congo.
Okay. Thank you.
So do they have women in seminary in Russia?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And is that true of the other seminaries around the world, or is it?
Oh, no, I think probably in most of them you would find that, yeah.
Good question.
Just wondered.
Well, we certainly in the United States.
Well,
that's
yeah,
true.
I do know some.
Yeah, we have women bishops who come. Bishop of Mozambique, when we were there, was a good colleague, good friend, but she had been elected by her peers to be a bishop. So that's not unusual. The president of the Council of Bishops about 5 years ago was Bishop Wiener from Germany, and she was our council president for 2 years. And we've had, but overseas, we've had little U.S. women who've been president.
Other questions?
Well, let me leave you just with this thought, and that is, this is an age in which the church is finding challenges, lots of challenges, lots of different ways. Some of them are good, some of them are just unfortunate. But challenges are also opportunities. And if the church is faithful to its call, if we are faithful to our call, then all will be well. All will be well. And all will be well.
Thank you so much for being here today.